Hi, and thanks for joining us here at mongodb.live. Today, you'll be hearing what's new with MongoDB Charts. My name's Tom Hollander. I'm the Principal Product Manager with the MongoDB Charts team. Joining me later in this presentation will be Scott Sidwell, a Senior Engineer, also with the Charts team. So the plan today is to give you a quick overview of what MongoDB Charts is. Then I'll be showing you a bunch of the great new features we've released with Charts in the last year or so. Then Scott's going to come and show you some of the great new embedding features that we've built. And finally, I'll wrap it up by talking about some of the features you can expect to see over the coming months. So what is MongoDB Charts anyway? Well, quite simply, we believe it is the best way for you to visualize your MongoDB data. So let me explain in a bit more detail why we believe this is the case. Firstly, Charts is fast, easy, and frictionless. It's built right into MongoDB Cloud, so there's nothing to deploy, nothing to configure. You can just get visualizing your MongoDB Atlas data in just a few clicks. Secondly, unlike most data visualization tools which are designed for relational databases, Charts has been designed from the ground up to work with the document model. That means it natively understands things like nested documents, nested collections, nested arrays, and you can get insights from those powerful data structures really quickly and easily. Next, Charts makes it really easy to share and collaborate. You can build some dashboards for your own analytics, you can share them with your colleagues, or you can share them with the world or your customers really easily. Charts is also a great option for developer productivity. So developers can build charts using the intuitive Charts user interface and then get those live visualizations into their apps through the power of embedding. Also, compared to a lot of data visualization architectures, Charts makes it super simple because you don't have any need for data movement or data duplication. You can visualize your data directly from your Atlas database where you store your data in the first place. And because of the workload isolation features that are built right into MongoDB Atlas, you don't need to worry about the data visualization workloads from impacting your transactional workloads because the analytics happens on secondary nodes by default. So hopefully some of you were at MongoDB World last year when we first launched Charts, and hopefully some of you have been using Charts over the last few months. So a natural question to ask is, okay, what's different? What's changed? What's new? And the answer is simply lots. And what I'll be doing today is walking you through just a few of the most important new data visualization and other features that we've built into the Charts products over the last 12 months or so. So let's go sort of area by area in Charts, and I'm going to start with data sources. Now, a data source is really how you tell Charts to connect to your data. So it refers to a specific collection in your Atlas database. And here are a few of the features we've added. Firstly, we have data source pipelines. This allows you to run aggregation queries every time your data is accessed from your collection. This allows you to do cleanup of your data if you have data quality concerns. And it also allows you to use $lookup, which lets you join data from multiple collections, which can be useful. We've also added an area called virtual fields that lets you extend the field panel of your chart builder to add fields that might have been missed by the sampling because they're only in a small number of documents, as well as calculated fields and fields that use different data types to what you'd prefer. So let me start by showing you some of these new data source features inside Charts. So here's Charts within my cloud project, and I'm already on the data sources tab here. So I've got a number of different data sources here, but today I'll be showing some demos that use live data from my Tesla Powerwall home battery system. Now, I've written some code that ingests that data from an API, and it's generally pretty good, but I have found that occasionally my API fails, and I have these bad values, which I don't want to clutter my charts with. So in the past, I could have filtered those out of every chart, but what I'm going to do instead is use this feature called data source pipelines. So you can see here I've written a $match stage where I'm filtering out any zero values from these particular fields because they will interfere from my visualization. I'm also using a $project stage here, and that is really just cleanup. I've got these sort of long names from the API, and I like to see these sort of shorter, more easy to understand names. So when I have these two stages here and I apply them to my data source, you'll see I get this nice little picture showing I have a $match stage and $project stage, which will execute every single time I access the data. So I can be confident that I won't have any of these data quality problems for any of my charts because I've attached this pipeline to my data. So let's go over to our dashboards now. So I've already built a dashboard, and I'll show you some of the existing charts a bit later on. But I'm going to start by creating a brand new chart. So let me choose that daily summary collection. And what I'd like to do here is create a chart that shows how much of my home energy usage is coming from self-generated sources. So that means from solar or data that's already, or energy that's already stored inside my battery. So I have a whole bunch of different fields here, but none of those actually answer that question directly. So what I want to do here is create what we call a calculated field that will figure that out for me. So I click on Add Field. You see I have missed fields or calculated fields. So today I'll use calculated fields, and I'm going to call it self-powered percentage. Now inside the value expression, I could use a Mongo query language expression, which could be quite complex and powerful, or I can use what's called a simple arithmetic expression. So here I can just enter the names of fields with like pluses and brackets and timeses and divided bys, etc. So what I'm doing here is I'm getting the energy from solar and from my battery, and I'm dividing it by all of my power usage, including from the grid. So that will create that as a percentage. So I'll save that. And once it saves, you'll see it's now added to my field panel as just another field which I'm able to use. But it is in italics, which means it hasn't actually changed my collection. It is purely a calculation. So let's go and create, this time a column chart might be nice. And I want to show my self-power percentage by month. So I'll start by putting the timestamp in the x-axis. It's automatically chosen bidding by month, which is what I'd like. Now let me get the self-power percentage and put that on the y-axis. Now I don't want to sum those numbers together. I prefer to do an average so I can see the average self-power percentage per month. Then I'll give my chart a title, so self-powered by month. And I'll save it to the dashboard. And you can see here I've got the chart that I wanted using the power of data source pipelines as well as calculated fields. So let's just quickly switch back to my deck. And let's talk about the next feature area, which is chart building. Now, in the chart builder, we've added a number of great new capabilities. The first is around data exploration. So this is a new menu that really lets you see your data before, during, and after it has been processed by charts. And I'll explain that more in just a few moments. We've also added a couple of great new chart types. So we have a gauge chart type, which is good for measuring progress against some kind of goal or total. And we've also added a word cloud, which is a great way of visualizing data that's centered around text. So let me show you a few of these features inside the chart builder. So we'll go back to my dashboard, and I'll duplicate the chart that I just created because I do want to create a chart that is kind of similar. And in fact, before I even create a new chart, let's look at this data exploration menu. So you can see here 3 options. And let me go through each of those in turn. The first option here is view source documents. So when I click view source documents, it lets me see the original data. So the data in the collection plus the data source pipeline. But what it lets me do is, rather than just see the structure of the documents, which I can see in the field panel, I can actually see some example values. And sometimes that can be really helpful in really understanding the range of values so I know what kind of chart I should be creating. The second menu is view aggregation pipeline. Now, the way that charts works is when I build a chart in Design a Chart, it builds this MongoDB aggregation query, which executes on your Atlas database. And the queries can get sort of quite long and involved, and it can be useful to see this query for either debugging purposes or education purposes. So I can actually copy that whole query and execute that in, say, the MongoDB shell. So you can see here it's got the stages I created from my pipeline. You can see here it's created this $add field stage for my calculated field. And then there's a bunch of other fields that had added groups and projects and things like that for when I dragged and dropped all those fields. So it's really interesting sometimes to see really how that all works under the covers. The final menu here is Get Chart Data. And this is where we can actually see the result of executing that pipeline. And the values we see in this grid correspond directly to the points that we'll see on the chart. So I can see the exact value, exact height of each bar. And I could also download this data as either a CSV or as JSON, which could be really useful if I wanted to do further analytics in a different application, such as a spreadsheet product. So that's data exploration. Now let's maybe build a new chart using one of those new chart types. So this shows me how much my power has been, energy has been self-powered each month. But what I'd like to see is how much of my current power, so recently, how much of that has been self-powered. So I'm going to use the new gauge chart type here. So let me choose the circular category and let me choose the gauge type. So I've already got a chart. It's got a few rooms for improvement. So let's see if we can do that now. So firstly, this is showing my average self-power percentage really since I switched on my data generation. What I really like to see is my current percentage. So I'm going to add a filter quickly. My API ingests data once a day. So I'll say every 2 days just to make sure I get at least one data point. So that's a good start. I'd also like to maybe choose a different color. So let me make this blue. And I don't need all these decimal places here. So let me go and quickly choose to format as a percentage and get rid of those decimal places. So that's pretty good. I can see in the last day or so, I've had 67% of my power from the solar and the battery, which is not bad. I do have a goal of getting 90% every day though. And you can see I'm not quite at my goal for today. And I like to actually be able to visualize that as well. So if I go back to the encoding panel, you see we actually have this, the value and the target channels. So I can go and drag another field to represent that target visually. Now, sometimes your target is actually naturally stored inside your collection. That 90% I just kind of made up and it's not in my collection. So what I can do is add another calculated field. I'll call it target. And I'll just define it as this constant value of 0.9. So I'll save this target field. I can go and drag that to my chart. And you can see this black line is showing the target now, but it's also now maxed the whole chart type at that target. And I really did want 100% to still be the maximum. So let me go back to customize and I'll make one last change here and I'll change the maximum of my chart type to 1. I'll give it a title of self-powered today. And this is the chart that I want. So let me go and save this particular chart to my dashboard. And we can see it sitting here proudly amongst all my other charts. So let's switch back to the deck. And while we are on dashboards, let's talk about some new features that we've added to dashboards. So some of the new capabilities we've added include interactive charts, allowing us to emphasize specific data series as well as panning and zooming scatter charts. We've added some data exploration features to dashboards as well. So that includes dashboard filtering, making it really easy for viewers to slice and dice data without modifying the charts. And public link sharing, enable you to share your dashboards with just anyone you want. And finally, I won't demo this, but we've done a bunch of performance work, including support for server-side caching, which really just makes your charts render a lot faster than they might have done previously. So let's go and show you some of these new dashboard features. So I mentioned I was going to show you some of these other charts, so let's do that now. So I built a bunch of different charts, again, all related to data from my Powerwall battery. And a few of these are multi-series charts, and there's sort of a lot going on. And if I'm really interested right now in understanding a bit more about my solar usage, rather than being kind of lost in the noise, what I can do is I can just click on any of the legend entries that I want, and I can highlight just one or multiple series. So let me just highlight the solar, and you can see here the solar is now just popping, and the other data is all dimmed in the background. I can also shift click here as well if I want to highlight more than one series, or I can click on the chart surface to show all the data back to its default value again. So it's just a nice feature you get for all of the multi-series chart types. So if I scroll down here, I also have a scatter chart here, and this is a pretty busy scatter chart that's telling me some information about the performance of my battery. But there's so much data here, I'm having a bit of a trouble understanding it. So what I can do now is I can use my mouse wheel and I can actually zoom in with the wheel as well as dragging and dropping to actually pan this chart. And once I do this, I can actually learn a bit more. I can see that I've kind of got two sort of lines here, two trend lines. So I have a bottom line here, which seems to be mainly data from 2017 and 2018. Then I have this top line here, which is mainly data from 2019 and 2020. So I can understand now that I've zoomed in on this data that there's probably been a change in my battery's performance between 2018 and 2019, which I might want to analyze in a bit more detail. And that would have been very hard for me to learn without this panning feature. So now let's talk about dashboard filters. So you can see I've got a bunch of different charts, but they're also showing different time periods, and it can be pretty difficult for someone to make sense of this. And if I wanted to find out, look, what's been going on in the last week, I'd have to modify every single chart to add a filter. And if I didn't have permission to do that, if I was just a dashboard viewer, I couldn't do that at all. Luckily, we have this new feature called dashboard filters. So what I can do with dashboard filters, as the author, I can decide which fields dashboard viewers should be allowed to use for data exploration. So this particular dashboard has got two different data sources in use. You can see them both here. And if I drag a field from this panel into the dashboard filters, this really makes this field eligible for filtering. So because I want to allow date filtering, I've dragged the timestamp field. But even though I've got like two different data sources here, because I've got some slightly different data, I do want to be able to filter all charts at the same time. So what I can actually do is expand this second data source. I can get my date field here and I can add it to that same card. So that means that this one timestamp card will actually control both data sets and all charts in one go. I could also go and choose a default value. So say last 7 days would be a sensible default. And if I wanted to, I could drag additional fields, but I don't really need to do that today because date filtering is all I really want to allow. So now I've done this, anyone who can access this dashboard, including people who only have viewer permission, will now see all of these charts. And you can see now, rather than showing many months of data, I'm now just seeing 7 days of data because that's what my particular filter says. And this is applying to all of my particular collections. You can see I've only got data for 2020, for example, in that scatter chart. I can now just go and change, say, to every 14 days. The charts will all update very quickly, and that gives me a different view of the data. Or conversely, I can go and change to a shorter time period, such as every 3 days. So it makes it super easy for that kind of data exploration. Now, this is great for me. And I could easily go into the access button and I could share this with other members of my MongoDB cloud project as well. But suppose I want to share this information a bit more broadly. So that's where dashboard link sharing comes in. So I can go and click on share this dashboard with anyone with this link. Now, because sharing can be externally, it can be potentially concerning if the data was sensitive, we have got a warning here saying that we've not previously enabled unauthenticated external sharing for this particular data source. If it was sensitive, I'd have second thoughts. As it is, I am fine with that. So let me just enable that. I can copy that link. And then if I go and open that particular URL, you'll see it basically looks identical to my other dashboard, except for I didn't have to sign in. I don't see the menus at the top, but I do have things like the interactive features as well as my dashboard filters. So anyone who's accessing this public dashboard can still filter and explore that data in that same way. So I could go and share this on social media. I could share it with my grandma. Anyone who needs to access this dashboard can now do it really easily. So let's go back to our deck. Now, last but not least, I wanted to talk just a little bit about embedding. And embedding is the ability to build a chart in the MongoDB Charts experience and then make it available inside an external application. So we did launch embedding about a year ago, but we built a whole bunch of new features since then. So we had some more options for rendering charts, including dark mode, hiding the MongoDB attribution, as well as dynamic filtering of embedded charts. But the really big news is around the Embedding SDK, which allows JavaScript developers to render and manipulate charts using code, not just iframes, and the ability to integrate with authentication sessions. Now, to tell you more about the embedding capabilities in charts, I'd like to throw you over to my friend and colleague, Scott Sidwell, to tell you more.
Thanks, Tom, and hi everybody. So let's get started and see what's changed with MongoDB embedding over the past year. First, let's have a look at the features that we've added to iframe embedding. So here is a dashboard that I've created that has a chart that compares the grid versus solar power usage for my house. Now I've decided to write a blog post about this, and I want to embed a chart that uses iframe embedding into my blog post here. As a refresher, to use iframe embedding, we can go back to the dashboard here, click this drop down and click Embed Chart. From here we'll click Enable Unauthenticated Access. This means that anyone who had the iframe URL can view this chart. Here we have a number of configuration settings for iframe embedding, but for now we're just going to copy the code snippet at the bottom here. I'll now switch across to the HTML for my blog post, and I'll replace the image that we had before with the code snippet that we just copied. Now if we switch back to the blog post and hit refresh, we can see it's now rendered my chart inline using iframe embedding. Now that we have a chart rendered using iframe embedding, let's look at some of the new features that we've added. As Tom mentioned earlier, we can now emphasize and de-emphasize series on embedded charts. Another feature we've added is the ability to set a dark theme for embedded charts. To do this, we'll go back to our dashboard here, and under the configuration settings that we have here, I'll click dark under the theme, and then I'll copy the updated embedding code. Now I'll replace the iframe that we embedded before with this updated code snippet. And now when I go back to my blog post, you can see it's now rendering a dark theme version of the chart. Very cool. Another feature we've added, the ability to hide the MongoDB attribution logo down the bottom right. To do this, we can go back to our iframe URL here and add and attribution equals false. And you can now see that the attribution logo has disappeared. The last feature that I'm going to demo for iframe embedding, which is also the most powerful, is the ability to apply custom filters to your iframe embedded charts. We can apply arbitrary MQL filters to an embedded chart by passing in a URL encoded filter to the filter parameter of the iframe. So to show you what this looks like, I'll first add a filter parameter to this iframe URL. And now I have a couple of example filters that I prepared earlier here. In this case, this is the filter that will only show the documents since the beginning of January. So I'll copy this URL encoded filter, go back to the HTML and paste it here. Now if we go back, we can see that the chart has failed to render because we get an error code 7 response. Error code 7 means that we're attempting to apply a filter with fields that we haven't whitelisted yet to be used for embedding. In this case, the timestamp field in the filter that we were using here. Now if we go back to our dashboard, you'll notice there's this user specified filters row. Here we need to specify the timestamp field, which is what we use for the x-axis of this chart. We require you to whitelist fields to be used for embedding to make sure that anonymous users can't use arbitrary filters to glean insight into your data that you don't want them to. Going back to view my blog post again and now hitting retry, we can now see that it's updated the chart to only show the data from the start of the year. We can also have more complex filters, as you might have seen before. So if I go back to my example filters here, now I'm going to apply a filter that will only show the documents in February. I copy this longer filter and replace the filter I had added before with this new one and go back to my blog post, we can see that it's now updated to only show the records for February. So that's been iframe embedding and the new features we've added. The biggest update for charts embedding is the release of our Embedding SDK. The Embedding SDK is a JavaScript package hosted on NPM with the Apache 2 license, and it's a brand new way we built to allow you to embed charts into your application using JavaScript. It has a number of features that build on top of and enhance what iframe embedding provides. So let's dive right in and see how we can get started with the Embedding SDK. So I'll go back to my dashboard here. And in the Embed Chart dialog, you'll see that we have this JavaScript SDK tab. When we click that, we now get told we need to download the Charts Embedding SDK, and we also get two variables, the chart ID and the chart base URL provided here for us. We'll come back to these later. The first thing I'll do now is go to NPM, where the Charts Embed SDK is hosted. Here we've added a whole bunch of example usage and documents to help you get started. All I'm going to use for now, however, is to copy the npm install command that we have in the getting started instructions. Now I'll switch back to my project and install the Embedding SDK here. Now that that's installed, we'll replace the iframe code here with a simple div tag. We'll give this div an ID of chart. This will be where the Embedding SDK will render the chart that it creates into. We'll then also create a script tag that will point to a local JavaScript file. This will be where we write the JavaScript to integrate with the Embedding SDK. So I'll now create that local JavaScript file. And now we can get started importing the Embedding SDK. First, I'm going to create an SDK instance. And this is where the base URL that we saw before comes in handy. So I'll switch back to my dashboard, copy the chart's base URL, come back here and paste it here. Next, I'll create a chart. And here I'll provide the chart ID that we'll get back from that dashboard. I'll give the chart a default width and height, as well as I'll set the theme to dark. The last thing that I'll do is call chart.render and pass it the div element that we added to the index.html before. Now if I start this project again, and go back to my blog post and hit refresh, you can see it's now embedding a SDK rendered chart into my blog post. To prove this to you, I'll go back here and set the theme to light and hit save. And now when we go back, we can see it's updated the chart in my blog post. So there's a couple of other things we can still do here. Since the SDK supports all things iframe, we can add filters. So similar to the filter that we added to our iframe chart before, I'm going to filter on the timestamp value. But now because we're using native JavaScript objects, we can just use the date object directly rather than having to use milliseconds. So here I'll just pass in the date that corresponds to the 1st of January. I'll make that greater than or equal to. Now if we go back to my chart on my dashboard, we can see it's updated to only show the document since the start of the year. We can also turn off the attribution. So if I go back to my code here and set show attribution to false, now when I go back to this chart, we can see that it no longer shows the attribution logo. We can also set the background to match our custom theme. So for example, the gray of this background. So I'll go back here, I'll get the gray of the background from my index CSS, and I'll set background to equal this hex code value. Now we can see that the chart is seamlessly blended into the background here. But I'll get rid of that because I liked how it looked before. So far we've been able to do all the things we can do with iframe embedding, but the SDK can do so much more. Rather than specifying a filter up front, I'm going to go back to my index.html and I'm going to add a date input. This date picker is going to allow me to decide how much data I want to show in my chart. I'm going to give it an ID of data from. I'll give it a type of date. And now if I go back to my blog post, we can see we get this little date picker down here that lets me choose from a calendar. Currently, however, it's not doing anything because we haven't wired it up to our chart. So let's go back to the JavaScript here. And now we need to firstly find that input element. Then we need to add an event listener to listen for when that input is changed, i.e. when I pick a date. Now I need to pass the date that I've chosen from that input. And then all I'm going to do is call chart.setFilter. And here I'm going to say timestamp greater than or equal to the date that we've chosen in our date picker. So now if I go back to my blog post here and pick a date, say the 1st of March, we can see that it's now filtered the chart to only show the energy usage since the date that I picked. So if we go back to the code, we can see here that chart.setFilter accepts any valid MQL expression, so this makes it really powerful. The SDK also allows us to interact with the chart dynamically. For example, we could refresh this chart on demand. So let's try and do that now. So I'm going to go back to my index.html. I'm going to add a button. I'm going to give this button an ID of refresh. I'm going to say refresh the chart. I'm going to go back to my JavaScript file and I'm going to add an event listener on this refresh button. I'm going to say when I click this button, then I want to call chart.refresh. This will tell the SDK to update the data that it's using to render the chart. So going back now, we have this little refresh the chart button. When I click on this, you can see the chart goes into a loading state to indicate that it's updating the data behind the scenes. The last thing that I'll show you here with unauthenticated embedding is how you can dynamically adjust the theme. This is really useful if you want to support both dark and light color modes in your own application. To do this, we can jump back to our index.html and we'll add a button now that we'll call theme and we'll say toggle the chart theme. Now if we go to our JavaScript file and we do a similar thing that we did for the refresh button, we'll get the element, add an event listener. And so when we click this toggle theme button, because we don't know what the theme that the chart is currently using is, we need to first get that by calling chart.getTheme. Then once we get that theme, we'll need to call chart.setTheme. And so we'll say if the theme was light, then we'll set the theme to dark. Otherwise, we'll set it to light. This is just a little bit of toggling logic. Going back to my blog post now and clicking the toggle the chart theme, you can see we're able to seamlessly toggle between the different color schemes for the chart. So that's been a brief overview of the unauthenticated embedding SDK. Now let's talk about authenticated embedding, which forms a huge part of this release. The authenticated embedding SDK allows you to restrict viewing of embedded charts to users who have already authenticated with an external identity provider, like Google or Realm Authentication. So we can see here that the embedding providers that Charts currently supports includes custom JWT, which means you can bring your own session or identity provider to MongoDB Charts, and we just require a JWT we can verify. Google Authentication, where you can integrate using an existing Google client or application. And Realm, where you can use an existing Realm application that you have to authenticate with Charts. So let's see what this looks like in practice. So I've already created a Realm application here that has two users, Scott at powerwall.com and Tom at powerwall.com. To use authenticated embedding, you'll want to go back to your dashboard here, close the dialog, and click on Admin Settings. Here you'll have the opportunity to configure an embedding authentication provider. I haven't yet configured a provider here, so let's do that now. Clicking Add New Provider will bring up a dialog where we can choose what type of embedding provider we wish to add. It's here we can choose between custom JWT, Google Auth, and Realm Authentication. So I'm going to go ahead and call this my Powerwall blog post app. Now here is where I'm prompted to choose between different providers. If I was to choose JSON Web Token, I'd be asked to provide a signing algorithm and the signing key. If I chose Google, then I'd need to provide my Google client ID. However, since I'm using Realm, I'll click Realm. I'll choose the Realm project that my application resides in, which is Powerwall project. And then I'll choose the Powerwall blog post app that I configured before. I'll now click Save. Now that I've configured this embedding authentication provider, I should be able to integrate Realm with the embedding SDK to render authenticated charts which only allow users with an authenticated Realm session to view them. So I'll go back to my dashboard here, click on my chart. Now if we go into the embedding dialog, I'll turn off unauthenticated access. Now I'll go into this authenticated tab and enable authenticated access. Now MongoDB Charts will be able to render authenticated charts using the SDK. So if we go back to the code and quickly switch projects, I'll start this up. We can see that instead of rendering the blog post immediately, I'm now prompted with a login screen. If I put in invalid credentials, we'll see that it's telling me that it failed to log in. If I put in the correct credentials, however, and these credentials correspond to the Realm application I created before, I'm now able to successfully see my blog post. However, I'm still currently missing my chart. So let's have a look at the code to see what's going on here. So this is running as a React application. the MongoDB Charts Embedding SDK can be integrated into all popular web frameworks like React. So if we go into app.js here, we can see that I've configured a Stitch client here using my Realm project. I've got a login form that will attempt to authenticate against this Stitch client with these credentials. And if it's logged in, then I'll attempt to render my blog post. But currently, I'm not attempting to render any charts into this new blog post here. So let's try and do that. To get started, I'll go back to my iframe example and just copy some of the code we wrote there. I'll copy the SDK instance we created. I'll paste that here. And I'll go back and I'll copy this chart that we created here. I'll paste this under this onload chart function. Okay. The final thing we need to do here now is call chart.render. And here we'll pass in the target container that we get from onload chart. If I hit save and go back to my blog post, now if I enter the correct credentials, we should see that I'm able to successfully see a chart being rendered. But no, wait, it's failed. And the reason this is the case is because currently we haven't provided any authorization or credentials to the Embedding SDK so that it can identify your user. So if we look back at the JavaScript SDK integration code here, you can see while I've authenticated with the Stitch client, I'm not actually passing it through to the SDK yet. So we can do this by passing in the getUserToken value. Now this value expects a function that returns a JWT that identifies your user. To use this with Realm authentication, you can use a helpful utility, the getRealmUserToken method that the SDK exports. This will handle the fetching and management of the user token for the Stitch SDK. So I'll just pass in the Stitch client to this function here. Now if I hit save and go back to my blog post and put in the correct credentials for the last time, now we should see that we're able to successfully render the chart using the Embedding SDK. That's been an overview of getting started with authenticated embedding. However, there's a couple of extra embedding features that only work with authenticated users. The first is injected filters. So if I go back to my dashboard here, we can see this inject filter per user row. Injected filters are a way to apply a custom filter for each user who views your chart. Because we can identify a user based off their JWT session, it means that you can write custom logic here to apply unique filters per user. For example, if we go back to my Realm application, I've configured the custom user data setting to provide some extra documents for my user. So going into my Atlas cluster here, we can see I've specified the cDataFrom attribute for each user in my Realm app. This cDataFrom attribute specifies the age of the data that I want to allow this user to see. So by using injected filters, I can actually enforce this at the chart level on a per user basis. So I'll go back to the injected filter per user row, and I'll replace this default filter with a similar one that we used before. I'll say timestamp greater than. But now what do we put here? So first we'll use the token, and since we're using Realm authentication, this token will actually be the Realm user profile. So here to use the custom data that we've attached to our Realm user, all we need to do is go custom_data and then cDataFrom. Clicking save and going back to my blog post here and hitting refresh. When I log in again, you should see that I'm no longer able to see all the documents that I were before. Instead, I'll only see the documents from the start of the year, as you can see here. However, if I log into my friend Tom's account, you can see that he'd been able to actually see all of the data for the chart. So this is just the tip of the iceberg of the power that injected filters can provide into your application. There's one final feature that we don't have time to go into today, but I do want to call out, and that is the delegated data fetching for Realm authentication. To show you what that is, I'll go back to the admin settings in Charts. And if I click Edit Provider here, you can see we have this toggle to fetch data using a Realm application, which I can turn on here. By checking the fetch data using Realm app and specifying a Realm service name here, you can actually delegate the access and authentication for what data a user can see in a chart to the Realm rules engine. This provides a really powerful way to have custom views into data for individual users. So that's been embedding using the SDK for both authenticated and unauthenticated modes. I hope you found that useful, and now I'll throw it back to Tom.
So thanks, Scott. I hope that's given you a great understanding of some of the great new capabilities that we've built in Charts, and particularly some of the new embedding features that we've built. So if you're like some of these things, hopefully you also like some of the things that we're going to be working on over the next few months. So let me give you just a bit of a preview of some of those features that we're building right now. So firstly, we are building a new onboarding experience. We want to make it really easy for brand new users to get productive and learn the capabilities of Charts very quickly. So as well as a new sort of welcome page, we will also be providing sample dashboards with sample charts and sample data, so people can explore some pre-built charts as well as create their own charts, even if they don't necessarily have data ready for visualization. Secondly, we are doing a lot of work around binning and sorting. So just a few of those capabilities will be being able to bin dates by week, being able to bin string values, so turning very fine-grained strings into coarser-grained categories, as well as more control over how data in a chart is sorted. We also are doing some work around customization. So that will include conditional formatting, so changing the color of, say, cells in a table, being able to share and reuse color palettes across multiple charts, and being able to change some of the things plotted on charts, including showing trend lines, secondary y-axes, as well as rearranging or hiding legends on multi-series charts. So if you like some of the things you've seen today and you aren't currently a MongoDB Charts user, it's really easy to get started. So all you have to do is to go to cloud.mongodb.com and sign up for MongoDB Cloud. And there you can also deploy your first Atlas cluster. And if you choose the M0 cluster size, that is free. Once you have your cluster, you can load in your own data, or if you haven't got any data right now, you can choose the option to load sample data. It only takes a few seconds to load some fun collections like movies and Airbnb data. Then click the Charts tab, and that will activate Charts within your cloud project. Then you can just build dashboards and charts, explore your data, have fun, do some of the things I showed you in today's demo. Once you have some charts that you love, share them with your mates, share them with your colleagues, and embed them in your applications. And if you've found anything that you'd like changed in Charts, if you have any ideas for new features, please let us know by going to our feedback site, which is feedback.mongodb.com. So thanks to everyone for joining me today. Just a couple of housekeeping things. So if you haven't checked out the keynote, please do that whenever you want. So go to mongodb.com/live/keynote to share the live stream of the keynote with your friends. And also, as part of mongodb.live, we do have virtual product booths. We do have a MongoDB Charts booth where you can also see some great demos of some more features in Charts and learn more about the product. So with that, thank you very much for joining us today, and we wish you happy charting.